Night pressed against the Nile, like ink seeking meaning. Beneath a moon carved from bone-white light, Egypt first heard thought made visible. Not thunder, not command, a whisper that measured the world into order. Jehuti, the silent scribe, weighed words against stars and taught men to remember. His feather balanced truth. His script bound chaos into form. Every stroke of reed on papyrus echoed creation's first sound, a promise that knowledge could outlast death. Within those signs lay a question that still stirs the ages. What happens when wisdom itself becomes the god it tries to describe? Night comes to the river, like ink poured from a jar. Reeds hiss, crocodiles slide beneath the skin of the water, and above the floodplain, a thin white curve hangs where the sky meets the black. In that curve, the first listeners heard a mind. Not a lantern, not a god who shouted with thunder, but a thinker who moved in silence. The elders named him Jehuti, the one who weighs, the one who writes, and said that when the moon changed its face, the world remembered its laws. Before any pharaoh set a crown on his head, the people of the Black Land counted by shadows. Crescent to half, half to full, full to waning. A cycle neat as a knot. Hunters timed their journeys by it. Boatmen hugged the banks when the river rose. Midwives read its silver for omens. Rhythm became rule. Rule sought a keeper. From that hunger for order, the divine scribe came into view, not born as men are born, but present wherever balance asked for witness. Out on the flats where the flood leaves silt like spilled flour, a child once traced a fish in mud with a reed. The mark hardened under sun, and when his mother returned, she read the day and the shape. Here we caught life. Here we ate. Memory fixed. This is how the first signs begin, not as inventions, but as acts of remembrance. The old storytellers said the curve of ibis beak matches the moon that measures time, and so the bird's-headed lord held the count of nights in his mind. How else could seasons be trusted? How else could bread be planned? Far from the river's common noises, a city rose where the desert light wavered like heat on metal. The Greeks would later name it Hermopolis. Those who lived there called it the City of Eight. In its court, priests murmured the names of the primordials, the couples who floated in the not yet, darkness with its twin, boundlessness with its mirror, the deep waters facing their own reflection, concealment paired with hidden breath. From that tangle of firstness, a hill lifted, a dry tongue of earth thrust up from possibility, and on that hill, speech happened. Not gossip, not plea, but the first exact words, a naming that told things what they were, so they could hold. Across the roofless halls of that city, oil lamps shook in evening wind. A novice scribe set his palm on a clean sheet and waited for the master's signal. Ink came the whisper, and the boy dipped the rush, hearing in that single sound the weight of 1,000 dawns. Behind him, walls sang with carved birds and serpents, eyes and doors, hands raised in adoration. To an outsider, they were pictures. To those inside the house of life, each sign was a breathing thing. A mouth meant speech and invocation. A seated god meant a name too potent for casual air. When the novice wrote, he was not drawing shapes. He was laying down the bones of reality. If creation began in speech, then speech must be kept clean. That is why the judge of words walks with a scale. On one pan rests a feather. Truth, harmony, the straight line the Nile cuts through chaos. On the other rests the human heart, full of acts and the intentions behind them. When the pans level, the world holds. When they tilt, the desert comes closer. Thus the keeper of balance made a ledger of existence, the bright and the broken, the oath and its fulfillment, the lie and its echo, all recorded in a script that glints like water. In the season when the river forgets its banks, a carpenter's daughter watched her father gauge a wall with a cord and a knot. "Who taught you that?" she asked. "The same mind that set the moon to count our nights," he answered, snapping the line. "Measure is devotion. A length of rope becomes a hymn if it tells the truth. In fields just cleared of flood, farmers set furrows by angles learned from the temple, and in the temple, men calculated the height of stars by angles learned from the river's slope. Everywhere the same thinking moved. If you hold one thing steady, you may know the rest. News travelled up and down the water. A calendar had been made. 3 seasons of equal dignity, inundation, growth, harvest, and 5 extra days like sparks shaken loose from the sun. People said the reckoner won those days from fate itself, playing a game against the moon so that sky and earth could birth their children. Whether the tale was told in laughter or awe, the moral did not change. Time is not a prison when wisdom keeps the key. The 5 added days became a hinge on which lives turned. Days for remembrance, for divine birthdays, for beginning again. Under painted ceilings, where gold leaf caught the light and threw it back like fountains, the chiefs of the House of Life gathered. Scrolls wound on ebony sticks lined their shelves, the papyrus bark's tang sweet on the room's cool air. A senior lector priest unrolled a narrow sheet. "Hear the rule," he said, "of writing." The novices bowed. Names of power must be written whole the first time, and then handled with care. Not every truth belongs in every ear. A spell is a tool and an oath. A misused sign cuts both the hand that draws it and the world it touches. The boys swallowed. One girl steadied her fingers to keep the rush from trembling. At the back of the room, a statue with an ibis head watched, as if weighing their breath. Of all the questions that grew in those shaded rooms, one took root and refused to be pulled. If the universe was spoken into order, where did the first phrases go? Some claimed there existed a record older than the oldest hymn, a scroll that contained the pattern of the sky and the rule by which minds bind thoughts to matter. They called it, in a whisper, the Book of Thoth. No one agreed on its shape. To some, it was a sealed papyrus hidden under a hill where serpents knotted. To others, it was not a thing in the world at all, but a current that moved through the initiated when they spoke with clean intention. Stories have a way of testing the living. A mason in the quarries once told of a man who learned a bird's grammar after reading a line he was forbidden to see. The birds taught him where water slept in stone, and he grew rich drilling wells that never failed. Then, greedy for more, he copied the line for a lord who used it to take another man's harvest by speaking over his fields. That night, a wind rose so hard it carved the plaster from the lord's walls and scattered the stolen grain into the marsh. The mason swore he saw a figure walk the edge of the canal, counting. Whether or not the tale is true, the lesson is clear enough to last 1,000 seasons. Wisdom without rightness breaks its bearer. Meanwhile, the river kept its school. Silt wrote on floodplain in broad strokes. Ibis feet stitched cursive across the mud. Children learned their letters with splinters of reed, chewing the pith to make it supple, staining their lips with the same black that would, on some distant day, record a king's vow. In every village, a thin boy with clever hands made lists, dates, figs, jars of oil, and as his marks multiplied, so did his authority. Not because the marks were pretty, but because they made memory public. A world where bread is counted is a world less subject to terror. That too is part of balance. Even power bends to keeping. A ruler once postponed judgment till nightfall, and sat alone with a tablet while the palace slept. The moon pushed a path across the tiles. From the courtyard came the clack of date pits in a bowl. If I say it, it is so, he told himself. If I write it, it endures. He thought of the feather and the heart and set his stylus down. A clean sentence is a difficult courage. In the morning, he reversed his decree and spared a village from ruin. The scribes recorded both orders and the reason for the change. And by sunset, word had moved from cataract to coast. The crown had remembered the scale. Not all learning is grave. A teacher at Hermopolis liked to start his lessons by drawing a goose. What is this? A bird? No, a sound. Laughter. He wrote the goose again and pronounced a name. Words are tools. Tools build temples. Temples house meanings. If you confuse the bird for the sound, for the god, for the law, you will hit your thumb with the hammer and blame the stone. In the back row, a bright child smirked. Years later, he would write a hymn that ended with a question, and the question would travel like a fresh wind through a stifled chamber. Which is heavier today, your heart or a feather? Of festivals there were many, but one belonged to number. On that day, every measure became a song. Ropes danced between pegs, cubits tapped like drumsticks along column shafts, and the high priest lifted a plumb line until its bob stilled. Straight, he declared, as the thought that first named straightness. Traders smiled at the word. Builders bowed their heads. In a world where everything has its proper weight, mercy is not softness. It is accuracy. Rumor loves grandeur, so the story of the hidden book did not stay indoors. Boatmen swapped guesses as they poled through Lotus. Hunters whispered of a hill whose stones cut sandals to ribbons, beneath which a cedar chest sat nested in bronze and ivory. Snakes coiled around it like braided rope. A singer added that the chest floated on dark water in a stone room, and that only a voice speaking the right sequence could lift it dry. Such flourishes make good nights. But in the house of life, the rule held. That which is not proven must be treated like flame. Warmth and danger are the same color. Across the centuries that followed, other lands would learn to call the scribe by other names. That is for later. In this beginning, the moonbearer belongs to the flood country. He walks the embankments with farmers who have just learned the comfort of a reliable count. He slips into the workshops where artisans draw grids across limestone to teach stone how to hold a face. He stands behind the shoulder of the young woman who, by lamplight, copies a prayer so softly that when she reaches the last line, she realizes she has been holding her breath. What, then, is a hieroglyph in its first hour? Consider a doorway carved on a tomb, a rectangle simple as the threshold of a reed hut. Look long enough, and the rectangle turns into a request. May the living feed the dead as the gods feed the world. Now add a loaf, a jar, a leg of ox, and the request becomes a machine. As long as the signs endure, offerings will be spoken into being. This is not trickery. This is trust in the contract that joins speech to reality. A contract the divine scribe drafted when dark was still unbroken and waited for an answer. Of course there were doubters. A fisherman with a scar across his cheek told a priest, "If your words are so strong, speak fish into my net." The priest laughed and said, "Words are not nets. They are banks. They give the river its shape, so fish can be found at all." Later that day, the fisherman pulled in a catch so heavy, his sons screamed with joy. He carried 3 to the temple and left them on a cool slab without comment. Faith and practice often meet like that. On the far side of the day, where the argument has exhausted itself. In the heat before noon, apprentices haul water jars up temple stairs 2 at a time. One stumbles, swears, and blushes. "Mind your mouth," the overseer says. Even a curse tilts a scale. The boy says nothing, then whispers an apology into the mouth of the jar as if the clay could carry it. Perhaps it can. Every vessel is a throat if you know how to listen. Every mark is a promise, which is another way of saying every mark is a burden. There is a second question that grows in the shadow of the first. If the hidden scroll exists, who may open it? A king? A priest? The woman who keeps the keys to the granary and knows hunger better than either? The first answer given in the House of Life is always refusal. Not because the book hoards glory, but because the reader must be able to bear what he asks to see. Even a perfect word spoken by an unready mouth becomes crooked in the air. Night again. The flood lies quiet as a sleeping ox. An old man walks the embankment with a torch whose smoke carries a faint sweet of resin. He pauses, lifts the flame, and waits for the silver curve to clear a fringe of cloud. "Show the count," he says, and the world obliges. A notch taken from a disc, an easy fraction on the face of heaven. He smiles, marks a board with charcoal, and turns back toward the village. A jackal watches him pass and does not follow. Balance has no enemies except neglect. Under a low roof, 3 novices trade stories long after they should have slept. The first insists the book lies under the western desert, guarded by a cat who speaks in men's voices. The second swears his aunt once heard a wanderer recite a line that stopped wind for half a day. The third says nothing, then admits in a whisper that he felt a weight behind him when he wrote the name of a certain god for the first time complete. Not fear, exactly, but the awareness that someone else was in the room. They swear by oil and year count to keep the confession secret, then drift off with ink still under their nails. Morning comes hard and clean. In the courtyard, a teacher sets pebbles in a line and asks his students to remove every other one without touching the ones they skip. Patterns matter, he says, when they succeed. They are the difference between noise and news. A girl holds the final stone in her palm and asks, "Who taught the first teacher?" The answer is a smile and a glance toward the sky. What follows from these beginnings is not a straight road. People will take what the scribe gives and turn it to matters both noble and mean, contracts and hymns, love letters and bribes, laws and lies written with the same steady hand. That, too, must be recorded. That, too, is weighed. But in this first light, the scale still shines, the feather still floats, and the heart that leans toward truth rises of its own accord. Some will say the book is a rumor to keep children obedient. Others will spend their lives looking, in tombs where the air tastes of stone flower, in canals where the reflection of the moon seems briefly to carry script, in the gaps between consonants where breath hides. Whether or not a hand ever lifts a cedar lid on a chest wrapped round with bronze, one thing is certain enough to build a world upon. The mind that measures the month is the same mind that steadies a sentence, a wall, a life. Listen. The ibis caller lifts from a sandbar and draws a white stroke across the river's skin. In its arc, the first listeners found an alphabet of tides and hours. In its patience, they learned the law that keeps heaven from collapsing into hunger. That law asks for company. It wants witnesses with reeds and cords, with jars and ledgers, with courage enough to write a thing and then live inside it. Here, at the mouth of morning, the question opens like a door. If meaning has a body, who will carry it? A young scribe takes up his rush. He wets the tip, breathes once to steady his hand, and sets the first sign. In that motion, the ancient promise stirs, that words can bind chaos without breaking the living world, and that those who keep the count may one day read the oldest page. Whether it lies under a hill of knives, or waits in the silence between two true syllables, the hidden record will not move. We will move toward it, one careful line at a time. The kingdom had learned the discipline of memory. What began as symbols on cave walls now covered the interiors of pyramids and tombs, carved deep into limestone and painted in colors meant to outlast death. Egypt no longer whispered its prayers, it engraved them. From the delta to the cataracts, the name of Thoth accompanied every act of preservation. He was invoked when a decree was issued, when a treaty was signed, when the heart of a dead man was weighed against eternity. His image, the ibis-headed god holding palette and pen, appeared wherever order met mystery. This was the age of builders and scribes. Pharaohs sought to outlast the desert through stone. Priests sought to outlast time through words. In the shadow of the pyramids, the first great libraries took shape. The houses of life, hidden within temple precincts, became sanctuaries for the written breath of gods. There, scribes copied hymns, medical instructions, geometry, and chronicles of kings, believing that every sentence continued the divine act of creation. To write was no longer a human task. It was the repetition of the first moment when thought became world. The oldest scriptures still visible in that era spoke of ascension. They covered the burial chambers of kings, instructing them how to rise beyond the sky and join the imperishable stars. In their carved lines, Thoth stood beside the soul as guide and record keeper. His words formed stairways through darkness, each sign a rung, each invocation a lantern. The texts were both map and mirror, guiding the ruler not only through the underworld, but through his own conscience. Every passage carried a single intent, to ensure that what was written on the walls of the tomb would also be written on the soul of its occupant. Outside those tombs, the scribes labored in silence. They were not merely writers, they were interpreters of divine rhythm. Their calendars followed the rising of Sirius and the swelling of the Nile. Their measurements turned the movement of the moon into the logic of time. The same God who counted the stars also taught men to count grain. When the river flooded, the harvesters consulted tablets to know when to plant. When the flood withdrew, the architects used the same numbers to set foundations square to the horizon. The pen and the plumb line obeyed the same God. It was said that within every temple there existed an invisible current, a flow of sacred speech linking the human voice to the divine mind. Each word spoken by the priests was a spark from that current, but the full source remained hidden. The myth grew that Thoth himself had written down the secret of creation, a set of scrolls containing the laws that governed heaven, earth, and the realm below. The scrolls were said to lie within the houses of life, guarded by initiates who understood that to read without purity was to bring disaster. From this belief emerged the idea that wisdom was a burden as much as a gift. The more one knew, the heavier the responsibility became. Priests trained for decades before they were allowed to touch the oldest papyri. They learned to purify the body, to restrain desire, to recite long invocations that aligned their speech with the pulse of Ma'at, the cosmic balance. Knowledge was treated like fire, essential, sacred, and dangerous. The mythology surrounding these hidden writings deepened with each generation. Some believed there were 42 of them, each dedicated to one of the provinces of Egypt and to one aspect of divine law: astronomy, medicine, mathematics, ritual, language, and judgment. Others thought of them not as physical texts, but as patterns woven into the world itself, revealed only to those whose hearts were in perfect alignment with truth. Whether parchment or principle, they were collectively called the hidden scrolls of the gods, and they formed the invisible spine of Egyptian civilization. As centuries passed, writing escaped the tombs and entered daily life. Contracts, inventories, and letters filled the hands of officials and traders. The art of the scribe became a profession as respected as priesthood or soldiery. Yet beneath the growing bureaucracy, the spiritual foundation remained unchanged. Every stroke of the reed pen still echoed the god's own. To write an account of Bali was to participate in the act that once ordered the cosmos. The divine had simply found new instruments. Within the sanctuaries, the doctrine of divine speech evolved. The priests came to teach that every word possessed two bodies, one visible, one hidden. The visible body was sound or ink. The hidden body was power. A word misused could wound the world. This belief lent the Egyptian language its precision. Every syllable carried weight, every title a cosmic function. To speak lightly was to invite imbalance. Silence itself became a sacred tool, the pause that allowed meaning to settle into harmony. The priests of Hermopolis, city of Thoth, organized their knowledge like a ladder of initiation. At its lowest rung were the teachings of arithmetic, writing, and record-keeping, tools of administration and architecture. Above them came the hymns, the sacred formulas, the interpretations of the stars. Higher still were the mysteries of life and death, the understanding of how the soul journeys through the underworld. At the summit, accessible to almost no one, was said to lie the Book of Thoth itself, the ultimate revelation, a scripture that contained not prayer but creation's design. Stories spread of those who sought that highest knowledge. Some were royal magicians, others wandering scribes who dreamed of mastering death. The tales never ended well. Each seeker found a fragment of the truth and paid for it. One was said to have read the words that command the winds and was torn apart by a storm. Another claimed to know the language of beasts and vanished into the desert, never seen again. Their legends served as caution more than inspiration. The priests retold them not to glorify ambition, but to remind their students that wisdom without balance destroys the vessel that holds it. Even so, curiosity endured. In distant provinces, far from the temple's restraint, magicians used fragments of sacred speech to craft charms and spells. Some of these words traveled as far as Nubia and Byblos, mixed with foreign customs, and returned to Egypt wearing new meanings. The line between religion and sorcery blurred. What had once been reserved for gods and kings now passed among traders and travelers. It was both a corruption and a testament to the gods' reach. During this same age, new forms of funerary writing appeared. The inscriptions that once belonged to royal tombs found their way into the coffins of nobles and officials. The divine language democratized. Immortality was no longer a privilege of kings. These coffin texts, painted in neat black and red lines, turned death into a classroom. The deceased addressed Thoth directly, asking not for wealth in the afterlife, but for comprehension. To understand the hidden writings was to be reborn. The walls of tombs became libraries, each inscription a lesson in how to cross from flesh to spirit. The more Egypt wrote, the more it believed that forgetting was the only true death. A man's name, once spoken, could not vanish. His deeds, once inscribed, continued to live. The act of recording thus became moral as well as practical. To omit truth was to wound Ma'at. To distort memory was to court annihilation. The scribe was both historian and priest, and his ink replaced blood as the offering to the gods. By the time of the Middle Kingdom, this reverence for the written word had woven itself into the structure of government. Laws were proclaimed through inscriptions, tax records copied in triplicate, royal edicts stored in sealed archives. The state itself had become an extension of Thoth's order. Yet beneath the administrative precision, the myth persisted that somewhere beyond the reach of kings and scribes, in a place no map could mark, lay the complete book, the one that could teach a mortal the speech of creation. Even the most cautious priests found themselves wondering what it might contain. Some imagined it as a compendium of perfect numbers. Others saw it as a mirror that reflected the true nature of the reader. A few believed it was both, a book that could change its form according to the worth of the one who opened it. But speculation never led to discovery. The more Egypt built, the deeper the mystery sank. Through flood and drought, conquest and restoration, the faith in Thoth's record endured. The temples rose and fell, dynasties shifted like sandbanks. Yet in every generation, someone took up the pen and continued the line. Every stroke connected back to the first gesture drawn in light before time began. Writing was immortality, and the scribe was its custodian. At the edge of the desert, when evening, wind combs the dunes, the air carries a faint rasp like papyrus unrolling. Travelers hear it and say it is the whisper of the god's pen, still moving across the page of the world, still inscribing every motion, every breath, every life. Somewhere, they say, the scrolls remain, perhaps not in vaults of stone, but in the pattern of things themselves, waiting for the day when someone will read the world as it was once written, word by word, into being. The kings of the Old and Middle Kingdoms built their immortality from language as much as from stone. To the world that lived beneath them, Egypt was not a nation, but an argument against forgetting. Every monument, every decree, every hymn carved in temple shadow declared that order was eternal, that chaos could be disciplined through words. The Nile gave the land its pulse, but Thoth gave it its memory. By the time of the 5th dynasty, Egypt had become a civilization of scribes. They moved through palaces and markets, temples and workshops, each carrying the same humble tools: a palette of black and red ink, a few sharpened reeds, a bundle of papyrus. Their presence transformed the world. They wrote the orders that built cities, the prayers that fed gods, and the stories that made men more than dust. To write was to participate in the divine rhythm, to fix the moment before it vanished, to make time itself obey the measure of the human hand. The priesthood of Hermopolis believed that in every act of recording, the god was present. When a scribe traced the name of a king, Thoth's breath steadied the hand. When the words were finished, the god's silence sealed them. Thus, the work of a scribe was never his own. He was a vessel, a reed through which wisdom flowed. This faith gave Egypt its discipline. It also gave it fear, for the same hand that could summon harmony could just as easily call disaster. Every copyist understood that to write carelessly was to wound the world. Within the temples, this fear became ritual. Before any sacred text was read aloud, the lector washed his hands, touched his tongue with natron, and exhaled a single breath toward the scroll. That breath symbolized permission, the balance between the mortal and the divine. Only then could the words be spoken. A mistake in recitation was not simply error. It was an act against Ma'at, a break in the equilibrium that held the stars. And so, the priests recited slowly, each syllable weighed like gold dust. The hidden libraries of Egypt grew from this precision. Behind stone courtyards and sanctuaries lined with incense burners, the houses of life guarded thousands of manuscripts. There were manuals on embalming, lists of offerings, instructions for the calendar, medical recipes, hymns to the gods. To the uninitiated, it was a collection of practical knowledge. To the priests, it was a living body, the fragmented anatomy of the god's own understanding. They believed that every scroll was a cell in the mind of Thoth, and that together they formed a consciousness larger than any temple, larger even than the sun. In those halls, time was layered. A novice might spend a decade copying a single text, unaware that in another chamber, the same words were being studied as part of a larger mystery. At the highest levels of initiation, language and creation became indistinguishable. The letters themselves, the curls of falcons and snakes and reeds, were seen as elemental beings, the architecture of reality. To know them perfectly was to know how the universe sustains itself. That knowledge did not remain contained. In the shadows of the cities, magicians and healers echoed the rituals of the priesthood, shaping their own interpretations of the divine language. They wrote amulets and charms in imitation of temple prayers. A woman might wear a strip of papyrus, bearing the god's name against her skin to ease childbirth. A farmer might bury a tablet inscribed with a hymn to ensure fertile soil. These gestures, half faith and half desperation, blurred the line between sanctioned devotion and forbidden practice. The priests tolerated what they could not prevent. It was better, they reasoned, for the people to imitate truth than to forget it entirely. Still, within the inner circles, anxiety grew. If the divine script could be copied by anyone, what would become of its sanctity? Thus began the doctrine of degrees, outer, inner, and hidden. The outer texts, prayers, hymns, seasonal rituals, could be taught freely. The inner texts were for the initiated. The hidden texts, containing formulas that bridged life and death, were locked away, sealed under the eyes of Thoth himself. These hidden writings formed the foundation of what would later be called the Book of the Dead. It was not a single manuscript, but a lineage of wisdom evolving across generations. Its passages were designed to guide the soul through the underworld, to speak the right words at the right gates, to recognize the deities who ruled the shadows. Every copy bore slight differences, as if each scribe added a piece of what he understood and removed what he feared. Across its many versions, the same figure appears again and again. Thoth, standing beside the scale, stylus in hand, noting the verdict as the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. To the living, this scene was more than myth. It was moral instruction. The balance of the scales was the balance of society itself. Just as the gods judged the dead, the pharaoh judged the living, and the scribes judged the record of both. Justice depended on accuracy. Morality depended on memory. The divine scribe did not punish. He documented. His impartial hand reminded Egypt that the world endures not through strength, but through truth faithfully recorded. As Egypt entered the Middle Kingdom, its theology matured into introspection. The hymns grew more personal, the prayers more uncertain. Men began to wonder whether the gods still heard them, or whether the divine had retreated into its own silence. In that silence, Thoth's image gained even greater authority. If the universe seemed indifferent, at least the scribe remained, writing, measuring, maintaining the ledger of existence. Through him, the order of Ma'at persisted even when kings fell. The houses of life mirrored the empire's expansion. At Thebes, Abydos, Memphis, and Elephantine, the archives multiplied. Each temple had its specialists, astronomers mapping the stars, healers cataloguing herbs, mathematicians computing the geometry of the pyramid's shadow. Every discipline traced its origin to Thoth. He was the inventor of number, the master of proportion, the father of the precise word. Knowledge of the world was the closest one could come to touching divinity. Yet the priests never forgot that every number had its reflection in the unseen, every measurement its moral counterpart. To know the length of a river without knowing the weight of truth was to be half-blind. The deeper these doctrines sank into the Egyptian mind, the more the myth of the forbidden book took root. The Book of Thoth became the mirror of human ambition, the ultimate secret always out of reach. Philosophers described it as a ladder made of words, each rung an understanding that led higher until the climber disappeared into the silence of the divine. But they also warned that the ladder had no railing, and those who climbed too fast fell into madness. To know creation's law was to risk becoming separate from it. In the villages, the story softened. Mothers told their children that the god's book lay hidden in the sky, written upon the surface of the moon. Each month, when the moon vanished and returned, the god was said to be turning its pages. The waxing light was his reading. The waning was his pause to think. In this way, the cycles of the moon became the visible heartbeat of the invisible mind. The scribes themselves took comfort in that rhythm. They measured their lives by the same pattern. Periods of fullness and retreat, of learning and reflection. Many left behind autobiographies carved into their tombs, not to boast, but to affirm continuity. They wrote of their service to Ma'at, of their care in writing truthfully, of their reverence for Thoth, who had given the gift of remembrance. Each self-portrait ended not with fear of death, but with confidence in preservation. As long as the words remained, so would the soul. And yet, under this serene devotion, a tension endured. The closer Egypt came to mastering the visible world, the more it longed for the invisible. When pyramids reached perfection and calendars aligned flawlessly with the stars, people began to sense the limits of precision. Knowledge, no matter how vast, could not answer why the world needed to be known at all. Somewhere behind the walls of order, mystery waited. That mystery was Thoth himself, not the ibis of the temple, paintings, not the kindly judge of the dead, but the idea that thought exists before the thinker. To seek his hidden book was, in truth, to seek the origin of consciousness. Few understood this. Fewer still dared to say it aloud. But within the inner chambers of Hermopolis, among shelves heavy with scrolls, some whispered that the divine scribe wrote not with ink, but with mind, and that every human act of understanding was one more word in his eternal manuscript. The myth of the hidden scrolls thus became not just a story about forbidden knowledge, but a reflection of Egypt's greatest conviction, that the universe was intelligible, and that to know it was to honor its maker. The priests would never claim to possess the full truth, but they believed the search itself sustained the order of the world. Every act of reading, every line copied in lamplight, was a continuation of creation. By the close of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt stood as a civilization of words, an empire written into being. Its kings ruled by decree, its people prayed by inscription, its gods spoke through the texture of stone and the shimmer of papyrus. And through it all, the unseen scribe endured, silent and exact, weighing every sound against eternity. When the moon rose over the western horizon and its reflection trembled across the river, the priests of Hermopolis said the god was at his work again. The night wind carried a faint whisper, like a reed drawn across parchment. Those who listened closely believed they could hear it. The sound of the divine hand moving still, writing not on scroll or wall, but on the fabric of time itself, line after line, word after word, until memory and creation were one. Night fell over Memphis with the slow grace of a curtain drawn by unseen hands. The city was old even then, older than its walls, older than the dust in its courtyards, and its stones held the voices of countless generations who had prayed, ruled, and died beneath the same indifferent stars. But in one of its high houses, lit by oil and guarded by silence, a single man kept vigil over words that were not meant to be read. His name was Setne Khamwas, prince of the royal line and priest of Ptah, second son of Hermes the Great. To the world, he was the scholar who knew every book within Egypt's temples. To the priesthood, he was something more dangerous. A man who believed that there was no such thing as a secret if one had the courage to find it. In the vaults beneath the temple of Ptah, he had seen the limits of mortal knowledge. He had copied every ritual of the gods, every spell for life and death. And yet the same question haunted him as it had haunted every scribe before him. If Thoth wrote the laws of creation, where is the book that contains them? The legend says that Setne first heard of the Book of Thoth from an aged priest whose eyes were already clouded with death. The man told of a tomb hidden on the west bank of the Nile, sealed in the reign of an ancient king, where a noble called Naneferkaptah had been buried. Within that tomb, wrapped in silver and guarded by serpents, lay the sacred text written by the god himself. 2 scrolls containing the wisdom of heaven and earth. One granted command over all living creatures. The other revealed the speech of the gods and the paths through the underworld. But the priest, before dying, had whispered a warning. Whoever took the book from its resting place would lose all that he loved. Warnings, however, were wasted on Setne. He saw in them not danger, but invitation. In the language of ambition, prohibition was only another word for promise. And so he gathered a small company of soldiers and magicians and crossed the river by night. The air was thick with sand and memory. The moon hung low, its reflection rippling in the current like a page half written. They found the tomb half buried beneath the dunes, a door of black basalt inscribed with curses. Setne dismissed them as superstition and recited the words of opening. The air that escaped from the chamber was centuries old, heavy with resin and silence. When the torches flared, they revealed a figure seated upon a throne of gold, his hands folded around a chest of cedar bound with bronze. At his feet lay the mummified bodies of a woman and a child. Setne felt the heat of the moment, but not its dread. He broke the seals and lifted the lid. Inside lay 2 rolls of papyrus glowing faintly as if lit from within. The letters shimmered with blue fire, not painted, but alive. For an instant, the chamber seemed to breathe. Then came a voice, dry and distant, speaking not to his ears, but to his mind. It was Naneferkaptah himself, the ghost of the long-dead prince, warning him to turn back. The spirit told him how he had once found the book at the bottom of the Nile, guarded by serpents of flame and iron, and how his victory had cost him everything. The gods, angered by his theft, had taken his wife and son, and his own body had been condemned to rest apart from peace. The book, he said, was never meant for the living. Its words were the breath of creation. To speak them wrongly was to undo what they described. But Setne, proud and brilliant, refused to yield. He summoned his own magic, binding the ghost with signs of power and claiming the book for himself. The tomb trembled, and the bronze serpents carved upon its walls seemed to writhe. When he emerged into the night, the stars above Memphis were cold and silent, as if unwilling to watch what would follow. In the weeks that came, Setne withdrew from the world. He shut himself within his chambers, reading the divine text line by line. The first scroll revealed to him the language of all living things, the rustle of leaves, the cry of falcons, the speech of the river itself. He could command winds and call down rain. The second scroll was darker. It taught him the ways of the Duat, the shadow world beneath the earth, and the names of the gods who ruled there. To read was to descend. At first, he used this knowledge for wonder. He healed the sick, stilled tempests, and made the dead speak. The people called him blessed, yet each miracle drew him further from the balance he once served. Power, once tasted, has its own hunger. He began to look upon priests and kings alike as children playing with stones, ignorant of the laws that moved the universe. He no longer prayed to Thoth. He considered himself the god's equal. But the world does not suffer rivals to its order. One night, as he read by lamplight, a woman entered his chamber without sound. She was dressed in linen white as moonlight, her hair braided with gold, her eyes dark with promise. She spoke softly, telling him that she too had studied the mysteries, that she had come to share his knowledge and his bed. Her presence was intoxicating, the embodiment of the wisdom he sought. In her gaze, he saw reflections of all he desired: power, beauty, immortality. They spent the night in a fever of delight and secrecy. By dawn, she asked him to prove his devotion. She demanded that he sign a contract written in his own blood, surrendering to her the scrolls of Thoth. In his pride, he agreed. He took the book from its chest and placed it in her hands. Then she smiled and vanished. When he awoke, he found himself lying naked on the cold stones of the temple courtyard. The scrolls were gone. The guards stood around him, horrified. Before he could speak, messengers arrived from the palace. His children were dead. His wife had vanished. The city whispered of blasphemy and curse. In his despair, Setne understood the truth. The woman was no mortal lover, but the spirit of Naneferkaptar's wife, sent to reclaim the book and punish his arrogance. The gods had repeated their old judgment. Those who steal divine words must pay in the currency of love. Setne returned to the West Bank, alone this time. He entered the tomb once more and found it restored. The ghost of Naneferkaptar seated as before, the scrolls lying upon his knees. The dead prince looked upon him with sorrow rather than anger. Setne bowed, placed his forehead to the floor, and begged forgiveness. Then, according to the legend, he sealed the chamber forever, commanding that no one open it again until the world itself demanded the book's return. In the generations that followed, his story spread through Egypt. It was told by firelight in the houses of scribes, by whisper in the courts of kings. Each retelling changed its shape. Some said Setne went mad and wandered into the desert. Others that Thoth himself appeared and pardoned him. But the lesson never altered. Wisdom is a flame that cannot be stolen without burning the thief. The priests of Hermopolis adopted the tale as parable. They recited it during initiations, not as history, but as warning. The god's knowledge was not forbidden because it was evil, but because it was exact. It demanded perfection from those who touched it, and no mortal heart could sustain that purity for long. To study the divine without humility was to unmake oneself. In the tombs of later centuries, small amulets appeared, ivory or faience tablets inscribed with a single glyph. The scribe's palettes flanked by the crescent moon. It was a symbol of remembrance. a prayer that the soul of the deceased might learn in death what it could not grasp in life. The myth of Setne had turned into doctrine. Only through surrender does knowledge become light. Yet even as the tale hardened into teaching, there were always those who dreamed of succeeding where Setne had failed. Among them were wandering scholars who searched the archives of the houses of life, hoping to glimpse a lost fragment of the god's text. None found it, though all found ruin, some to disease, some to madness, others to the slow corrosion of obsession. The temples did not curse them, they pitied them. The search for divine wisdom was the noblest and most perilous of callings, and in their failure, they fulfilled the warning of the story they had ignored. By the end of the New Kingdom, the name of Setne had become a shadowed proverb among scribes. To be as Setne was to be brilliant beyond safety, to look upon truth without blinking and to pay for it. His legend marked the boundary between learning and temptation. Beyond it lay not enlightenment, but the silence of the gods. Still, the tale endured because Egypt needed it. Every civilization that reveres knowledge also fears it. The myth of Setne offered both reverence and restraint, a reminder that words are living forces and that even the wisest hand trembles before the divine page. Somewhere, beneath layers of sand and history, the god's book remains sealed, not lost, but waiting for a world wise enough to read it without hunger. For now, the priests still trace Thoth's feather on the air and speak his name at moonrise. They know that the greatest magic is not in the book itself, but in the restraint to leave it closed. Time did not bury the tale of Setne Khamwas. It refined it. Centuries passed, dynasties fell, and new kings ruled from the same palaces where Setne had once read by lamplight. But the story of the prince who dared to steal from the gods remained carved in Egypt's collective mind. It was no longer merely a warning whispered by priests. It became a reflection of Egypt itself, brilliant, learned, disciplined, yet forever tempted by the threshold between mortal and divine. In the years following his disappearance, Memphis remained uneasy. The priests of Ptah recorded strange phenomena, torches that burned blue in the temple halls, walls that hummed with faint vibrations during full moons, voices that seemed to murmur from beneath the floors. The oldest among them said these were echoes of the book's awakening, the lingering breath of a knowledge that could not fully return to silence. The priests sealed their archives, and an edict was issued forbidding any further search for the scrolls. But curiosity is as enduring as stone. Among the younger scribes, the legend inspired not fear but longing. They told themselves that Setne's sin was pride, not study, that perhaps the book could yet be approached with purer motives. And so the myth took a second form, the tragedy of the seeker who falls because he climbs too quickly. To the scholars of later centuries, Setne became both sinner and saint. His downfall embodied Egypt's paradox, that wisdom is the path to salvation and the road to ruin. Plays and recitations dramatized his struggle. Storytellers on market corners spoke of the ghostly woman who seduced him, her beauty half human, half divine. They described how she appeared bathed in lunar glow, each step stirring the sand as if walking upon water. Every listener knew she was more than a woman. She was temptation itself, the desire for forbidden understanding given form. The priesthood never denied the story, but they refined its moral. In their version, Setne's true transgression was not his theft, but his belief that knowledge was possession. The divine word they taught cannot belong to anyone. It flows like the Nile, eternal, unstoppable, owned by no hand. To try to claim it is to dam a river that feeds the world. Through these interpretations, Setne became Egypt's eternal pupil, the one who loved knowledge so completely that he lost everything to it. In temple carvings made centuries later, he appears kneeling before Thoth, holding out a papyrus scroll in surrender. The god accepts it, not with anger, but with quiet mercy. In the faint lines of those carvings lies an unspoken understanding. Even failure, when born from devotion, can serve the balance. As Egypt's power waned and foreign tongues began to echo in its streets, the myth evolved again. Greek scholars, enchanted by the story, translated it into their own idiom. They saw in Setne's tragedy the reflection of a truth they recognized: the cost of hubris, the punishment of the thinker who exceeds mortal limits. To them, Setne became Khamwas, the philosopher who reached too far. His Book of Thoth merged with their concept of divine wisdom, Sophia, and from that fusion, a new figure began to emerge. Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, a god philosopher who united the Egyptian and the Hellenic minds. But before that synthesis took root, the Egyptian version lingered, subtle, self-aware, endlessly retold. Some versions end with Setne's repentance. Others claim he wandered the desert until death, haunted by whispers from the book he once held. In a few, he returns to the tomb and guards it himself, transformed into a spirit who warns intruders away. His penance, they say, is eternal watchfulness. Whatever form it took, the myth carried a lesson deeper than superstition. It suggested that there are limits not set by fear, but by necessity, boundaries that keep knowledge meaningful. To know everything is to destroy the distinction between knowing and being, to extinguish curiosity itself. The Egyptians understood this long before philosophy gave it words. The balance of Mayat required ignorance as well as insight. Darkness had its role, silence its virtue. And so, in the twilight of the New Kingdom, when Egypt was weary of conquest and the priests struggled to preserve what remained of their authority, Setne's legend served as mirror and guide. Every initiate who entered the House of Life was told his story before he was allowed to touch the sacred texts. The lesson was simple: learning begins with humility. The first rule of writing was not grammar, but restraint. Those who copied his tale onto papyrus gave it the same reverence as the hymns to the gods. The story was placed beside medical treatises and calendars, as though it, too, contained a cure, a remedy against the sickness of pride. In time, the priests even added his name to lists of honored ancestors, for he had preserved the balance through his failure. It was said that Thoth forgave him because his error had reminded men that wisdom without reverence cannot survive. Outside the temples, among the ordinary people, the myth softened into folk belief. Mothers told their children that the gods' words were stored in the stars, and that when lightning flashed, Thoth was writing again. A reminder that some truths remain too bright for mortal eyes. The peasants of the Delta spoke of a ghostly scribe seen wandering near the river at night, carrying a lamp that never burned out. He would approach those who labored late in the fields and ask what they sought. If they answered bread or shelter, he smiled and passed on. If they said knowledge, he would vanish, leaving behind a trail of ink across the ground. Even when belief turned to memory and memory to myth, the story endured because it captured something irreducibly human: the hunger to understand, the longing to reach beyond the visible. The Book of Thoth remained the perfect symbol of that longing, a mirror that reflected not the gods, but the seeker's own heart. In the centuries that followed, when foreign powers came to rule the land, new scholars opened the old tombs in search of treasures and spells. The priests watched in silence. They knew that no conquest could claim what had never truly been lost. The book remained beyond reach, perhaps because it was never physical at all. The more Egypt changed, the more it became clear that the divine words existed not in scrolls, but in the continuity of thought, in the discipline of writing, in the measured recitation of ritual, in the very belief that truth demands balance. Thus, the legacy of Setne was paradoxical. He had failed in his quest, yet through that failure, he had preserved the sacred boundary. The God's book could remain hidden precisely because someone had once tried to find it. His story became the hinge between myth and morality, a narrative of loss that protected the sanctity of knowledge itself. As night settles, once again, over the ruins of Memphis, the sands conceal whatever tombs might still lie beneath. Wind traces the same patterns across the dunes that once swept over Setne's footprints. To the traveler who pauses there, the silence feels heavy, as if the desert listens. Somewhere below, perhaps deeper than time, the God's book rests, its letters made of light, its pages sealed by the will of Ma'at. No one will read it until the world learns to ask without demanding, to seek without taking. Until then, Thoth writes elsewhere, in the orbit of the moon, in the geometry of the stars, in the rise and fall of knowledge itself. The legend of Setne remains his reminder that even the wisest of mortals must learn to read only what they are ready to carry. By the time the last native pharaoh laid down his crown, Egypt had already begun to speak in other voices. Armies crossed its borders with banners of silver and blue. Merchants brought not only spices but alphabets, and the temples of Thoth, where the moon was once worshipped in silence, began to echo with foreign speech. The Persians had ruled and departed, leaving the gods untouched, but the spirit of Egypt restless. When the Greeks arrived, they did not destroy what they found. They listened. To them, the Nile was not a river, but an oracle, and its temples were not relics, but libraries of living thought. The Greeks had their own gods of eloquence and reason, but when they entered the sanctuaries of Hermopolis and saw the ibis-headed scribe holding the palette and pen, they felt an uncanny familiarity. Their own Hermes, messenger of the gods, inventor of speech and guide of souls, seemed to stand before them. The union was inevitable. The god of Egypt and the god of Greece became one, and they named him Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great. At first, the priests of Egypt accepted this as courtesy, another way for strangers to honor their gods. But something deeper began to happen. As Greek scholars settled in Memphis and Thebes, they sought not conquest but comprehension. They translated the hymns of Thoth, studied the geometry of the temples, and questioned the meaning of the hieroglyphs carved on every wall. The priests, in turn, explained that their sacred writing was not letters, but living images, each a window into the structure of the world. For the Greeks, this was revelation. They had always sought knowledge through reason. Here was a civilization that sought it through symbol. When Alexander's empire gave birth to Alexandria, the exchange between Egypt and Greece became complete. The new city stood between sea and river, between east and west, a physical reflection of the balance Thoth had always guarded. In its streets, the voices of scholars mingled with those of merchants. Its air smelled of papyrus and incense. Within the library, knowledge from every known land was gathered and copied, as if to reconstruct the mind of the world. Greek philosophers walked beside Egyptian priests, each trying to understand the other's way of approaching truth. In this meeting, the ancient Egyptian idea of divine order met the Greek belief in rational structure. The priests spoke of Ma'at, the balance that keeps the stars steady and the soul pure. The philosophers spoke of logos, the reason that orders all existence. The two words, though born from different tongues, meant nearly the same thing. Thoth became the bridge between them, the god of language, logic, and law. The Greeks saw him not only as messenger, but as the architect of wisdom itself, the mind that thinks through nature. From this encounter arose a body of writing unlike any before. Priests who had studied the old hymns began to compose dialogues inspired by Greek philosophy. Philosophers, in turn, borrowed the rhythm of Egyptian ritual. The result was a new voice, half revelation, half reasoning, that spoke of the soul, the cosmos, and the path to divine knowledge. These texts would later be gathered under the name Corpus Hermeticum, but in the beginning they circulated as whispered teachings. They described a universe alive with intelligence, governed not by chance but by thought. In these writings, Hermes Trismegistus, the union of Thoth and Hermes, taught that all things are one mind, expressing itself through countless forms. The stars, the gods, and the hearts of men were reflections of the same order. To understand the heavens was to understand oneself. To know oneself was to approach the divine. It was philosophy written in the language of devotion. To a world weary of warring gods, it offered unity. Alexandria became the crucible for this synthesis. Within its marble halls, astronomers studied the movement of the planets, not as cold mechanics, but as the dance of living intelligences. Physicians learned anatomy by studying the preserved bodies of the dead, believing that in the human form, the architecture of the cosmos was repeated. Mathematicians used Egyptian proportion to measure harmony. Poets described the Nile's flood as the pulse of divine reason. For the priests of Thoth, this exchange was both gift and risk. Their sacred truths had always been guarded within temple walls. Now they were being written in Greek and discussed in public. Yet they understood that the god of wisdom could survive only by transformation. The ibis of Hermopolis was now the philosopher of Alexandria, and the balance of Ma'at had found new life in the geometry of thought. The Hellenic rulers who followed Alexander, the Ptolemies, encouraged this mingling of faith and intellect. They built temples in the old style, but carved the inscriptions in both languages. They honored Isis and Serapis, gods of Egypt reborn in Greek form. In their courts, scholars debated not which gods were true, but how all gods might be expressions of a single divine mind. This idea, that the truth was one though its names were many, became the cornerstone of Hermetic philosophy. The myth of the Book of Thoth reappeared in this new world, reshaped but unchanged in spirit. The Greeks no longer believed it to be a literal scroll hidden in a tomb. They saw it as a metaphor for divine intellect, a book written across the fabric of the universe. Each element of creation was a word, each human thought a reading of that word. Those who studied nature, mathematics, or the stars were said to be reading fragments of the same cosmic scripture. The task of the wise was to piece those fragments together, to restore the book of the world. For the philosophers of Alexandria, Hermes Trismegistus became both author and symbol of that cosmic text. They imagined him as the first teacher of civilization, the one who revealed science and sacred law, who taught men to write, to reason, and to see the divine in all things. In him, the Egyptian reverence for the scribe met the Greek reverence for the thinker. The God who once weighed hearts in the afterlife now guided souls toward enlightenment. Yet, as always, knowledge carried its shadow. The same texts that preached balance also warned against arrogance. They taught that the divine mind reveals itself only to those who are pure of intention, that to seek understanding without virtue is to invite confusion. Echoes of Setne Khamwas lingered in these teachings, the reminder that wisdom without humility leads only to blindness. The Hermetic writings insisted that the soul must rise step by step, shedding ignorance as the moon sheds shadow until it can reflect the light without distortion. Across Egypt, the temples adapted. Priests who once served under the open sky now lectured in the colonnades of Greek courtyards. The language of prayer softened into that of discourse. Yet even as the words changed, the heart of the faith endured. Offerings were still made to Thoth. Lunar festivals were still held when the first crescent appeared. The god of writing had merely turned his stylus toward a broader world. The Greeks, for their part, saw in Egypt not a foreign land, but the origin of their own mysteries. Pythagoras, Plato, and later scholars traced their lineage to the priests of the Nile. They claimed that the philosophy of Greece was the child of Egyptian wisdom, that the truths of Thoth had been translated into the language of reason. Whether this was history or myth mattered little. What mattered was the recognition that wisdom was universal, older than any nation. Through this recognition, Egypt gained a new immortality. Even as its political power waned, its ideas spread farther than its armies ever had. The name of Thoth became a symbol for all secret learning. The image of Hermes Trismegistus adorned the walls of academies from Alexandria to Athens. The divine scribe had transcended geography. He was no longer only Egyptian or Greek. He was the voice of the thinking world. When night descended over the Mediterranean, sailors looked toward the moon, rising above the delta, and said it was the lamp of Hermes Trismegistus, watching over those who sought wisdom. In their belief, the light that once guided the dead now guided the living mind. Egypt, though changed, had achieved what its own myths had promised, the preservation of knowledge beyond death. Its gods had survived by transforming their language, its philosophy by surrendering its form. In the union of Thoth and Hermes, the ancient and the new had found a balance worthy of Ma'at herself, the balance between reason and revelation, between word and silence. The city at the mouth of the Nile shone like a mirror for that harmony. From its libraries, the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus would later travel to Rome, Byzantium, and the far-off lands of the future. And though empires would rise and fall, the idea born there, that the world is a book written by mind and meant to be read with reverence, would endure. In the end, Egypt had not been conquered. It had converted its conquerors. Its gods wore new names, but its wisdom flowed quietly through every tongue that came after. The scribe of the gods had done what he had always done, recorded the story of creation and ensured that its meaning would never be lost. By the first centuries before the Common Era, Egypt had become a meeting ground of worlds. The sand no longer belonged to a single empire. It carried the footprints of Persians, Greeks, and traders from beyond the Mediterranean. Yet, amid the bustle of conquest, something extraordinary occurred. The wisdom of the Nile began to speak a new tongue. What the old temples once guarded in stone now spread in parchment and dialogue. Thoth, the Egyptian god of order and measure, found a second life as Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great Hermes. The transformation was more than a translation of names. It was a translation of spirit. In the Greek imagination, Hermes was the guide between worlds, the herald of gods, protector of travelers, and inventor of letters. When Greek philosophers saw the ibis-headed Thoth holding a stylus and scroll, they recognized a familiar truth. Both gods served as intermediaries between mortal mind and divine reason. To merge them was not a gesture of conquest, but of continuity. It was as though the same intelligence had merely changed its accent. The Ptolemies, Macedonian rulers who governed Egypt after Alexander's death, nurtured this fusion deliberately. They built temples in the traditional Egyptian style, but filled them with inscriptions in Greek. They sponsored priests fluent in both languages, encouraging the belief that the two civilizations were threads of a single tapestry. Under their reign, the old centers of knowledge, Hermopolis, Heliopolis, and Memphis, entered into dialogue with the new city of Alexandria, where the sea met the river and ideas from every land converged. In Alexandria's vast library, scrolls from across the world lay side by side. Scholars read texts of Babylon, India, and the Nile, searching for a unifying principle behind their varied myths. They found it in the figure of Hermes Trismegistus. He became the teacher of all ages, the source of geometry, astrology, medicine, and philosophy. In him, the Egyptian reverence for sacred order merged with the Greek devotion to reason. He was both God and sage. The divine intellect made human enough to speak. The writings attributed to this new Hermes, later known as the Hermetica, captured that unity. They were written not by one hand, but by many, over centuries, by Egyptian priests writing in Greek and Greek thinkers steeped in Egyptian faith. Each text sought to explain how the visible world mirrored the invisible, how the movement of stars echoed the structure of thought, and how the soul might return to its origin through understanding. The language of science became the language of prayer. These works depicted a cosmos alive with consciousness. The sun was not merely fire, but the mind of God. The planets were living intelligences tracing the music of order. Humanity stood between worlds, mortal in body, divine in spirit, capable of comprehending creation, because the same light that shaped the heavens burned within the human heart. For the first time, Egyptian theology and Greek philosophy met on equal ground. Both saw knowledge as a sacred ascent. In the old temples, the priests of Thoth recognized the familiar pattern. They had long taught that creation began with thought, that the world was spoken into being by the divine word. Now, in Greek, that word was called logos. The philosophers claimed that logos was the principle of all things, the reason behind existence. To the Egyptians, this was simply Thoth under another name. When they heard that Hermes Trismegistus had taught the universe was born from divine speech, they nodded in recognition. Their god had survived translation. Alexandria became the stage for this new synthesis. In its lecture halls, geometry and theology intertwined. Astronomers studied the sky to understand the will of the divine mind. Physicians dissected the human body as a reflection of cosmic design. The city's scholars spoke in equations, but dreamed in symbols. The priests, too, adapted, teaching that their ancient hymns were allegories for the laws of nature. The temple ritual and the philosopher's theorem were now seen as two languages describing the same truth. Among the most influential of these Hermetic writings was a dialogue called Poemandres, in which the divine intellect reveals to man the origin of the cosmos. It teaches that creation began as light emerging from thought, that man was formed in the image of the Creator, and that salvation lies in remembering that image. The tone is both mystical and precise, the style of a revelation written by a mathematician. For the Greeks, it was prophecy. For the Egyptians, it was memory. The myth of the Book of Thoth also resurfaced, no longer as legend of a hidden tomb, but as metaphor for the universe itself. The Hermetic thinkers said that the world was the divine book, its pages the heavens, its letters the stars. To read it was to practice philosophy, To study its proportions was to worship. The forbidden wisdom that once tempted Setne Khamwas had become the goal of every sage, the rediscovery of the pattern that binds the whole. In this new context, Thoth's earlier association with the moon took on symbolic meaning. The moon was the mirror of the sun, reflecting light but never creating it. Likewise, the human intellect could reflect divine knowledge but not originate it. True understanding, the Hermetic masters taught, came through contemplation, not control. The seeker was to purify his mind until it became like the moon, calm, reflective, and clear enough to hold the image of truth. The merging of Egyptian mysticism with Greek rationalism created a worldview of astonishing coherence. The universe was no longer a battleground of gods, but a single living organism, animated by mind. Humanity's purpose was to understand its own place within that organism, to act as conscious witness of divine order. This was the ancient doctrine of Ma'at expressed through philosophy, balance as law, harmony as salvation. But not all welcomed this blending. Traditional priests feared that translating their mysteries into Greek words would dilute their power. Philosophy, they said, could describe the divine, but not invoke it. A ritual is not a metaphor. It is an act that keeps the world alive. Yet even those who resisted felt the current of change. The old rituals survived, but they now shared their meaning with discourse. Hieroglyphs began to be seen as symbols of philosophical truths, not living beings. What had once been spoken with incense and drum was now debated in lecture halls. Still, this shift did not erase Egypt's soul. It preserved it. The gods were no longer confined to statues. They became principles that could travel beyond borders. The ibis of Hermopolis spread its wings into the imagination of Greece, Rome, and eventually every land touched by their thought. Thoth, who once measured time by the turning of the moon, now measured eternity through the reasoning of men. As centuries turned, Egypt's temples aged, their columns eroded by wind and conquest. Yet the writings of Hermes Trismegistus endured, copied by scholars in Alexandria, translated into Coptic and Greek. They traveled across the Mediterranean like seeds on the tide. Wherever they landed, they sprouted new philosophies. Stoics, Gnostics, and later Christian thinkers all found in them a familiar voice, a promise that faith and intellect were not enemies, but twins. The city that had birthed this union eventually fell to fire and war. The library burned, scrolls turned to smoke. Yet even as ashes drifted over the harbour, fragments of the Hermetic texts survived in the minds of those who had studied them. The divine scribe's work could not be undone. The God who first taught men to write had already written himself into the human mind. In the twilight of the ancient world, when the temples grew silent and new faiths rose to claim the heavens, the figure of Hermes Trismegistus remained. He was invoked by alchemists and philosophers, by mystics who believed that the wisdom of Egypt still whispered beneath the surface of all religions. They spoke of him not as idol, but as idea, the embodiment of universal reason, the witness who bridges matter and spirit. Thus, the Greek encounter did not erase Thoth. It multiplied him. From the quiet sanctuaries of the Nile to the echoing halls of Alexandria, his voice adapted, translated, and survived. The ibis became the messenger, the scribe became the sage, and the Book of Thoth became the cosmos itself. When the moon rose above the broken pylons of the old temples, the priests of a fading era said it was still his lamp guiding thought through darkness. And in the minds of the philosophers who inherited his name, that same light burned, no longer lunar, no longer Egyptian, but eternal. For in the marriage of Egypt and Greece, the god of wisdom had achieved his highest act of writing. He had inscribed himself not upon stone, but upon the human capacity to think. When the Romans inherited Egypt, they believed they had conquered the oldest kingdom of the world. They marched beneath the sun that had once shone on the pharaohs, built their fortresses beside the same river, and renamed its gods in their own tongue. Yet even Rome could not silence the undercurrent of Egyptian thought. In the shadows of the empire's temples and academies, a quiet revolution of mind unfolded, one that would outlive its conquerors. By the 1st century, the memory of Thoth had become inseparable from that of Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great. His name passed between philosophers like a cipher. To some, he was a man who had lived before the flood, the first sage to write of divine things. To others, he was a god, older than the stars, whose wisdom had descended in fragments. Whatever his nature, his words were revered as a bridge between heaven and earth. They were not read for dogma, but for revelation. Alexandria remained the heart of this inheritance. The great library had burned more than once, yet the city still breathed learning. Its priests continued to copy and translate. Its philosophers debated under porticos that smelled of salt and papyrus. Here the final works of the Hermetica were gathered and refined. Texts such as the Poimandra, Asclepius, and the Kore Cosmu. Their voice was not the voice of priests chanting before statues, nor of scholars cataloguing stars. It was the voice of Hermes himself, speaking as divine intellect to the soul of man. These writings described a cosmos alive with thought. They taught that God was not distant but immanent, that all things existed within a single mind. Humanity was that mind's reflection, mortal in body, divine in origin. The world, therefore, was both prison and temple. To live without understanding was to remain trapped in the shadow. To awaken was to ascend toward the light that gave all things being. Salvation, for the Hermetic philosophers, was not obedience, but comprehension. The Poimandras told the story in allegory. The seeker, lost in despair, is visited by a radiant being, the mind of the universe. The vision reveals creation as a descent of light into matter, a fall and a promise of return. Every soul, born from divine fire, forgets its origin and must remember it through wisdom. The text ends not with apocalypse, but with invitation. Man must awaken and become what he already is, a fragment of the eternal mind. To later ages, these writings seemed mystical, but to those who wrote them, they were scientific in the truest sense. The Hermetic philosophers sought patterns in nature, in numbers, in the movement of stars, in the proportions of the human form, believing that all mirrored one design. What earlier priests had expressed through ritual, they expressed through study. Knowledge itself became the sacred act. To contemplate was to pray. To discover was to worship. Rome's scholars found in these teachings something that their own Stoic and rational traditions lacked: wonder. The empire ruled by law, but its philosophers hungered for meaning beyond discipline. The Hermetic texts offered a vision in which reason and divinity were not opposed. The gods were no longer fickle figures of myth, but aspects of a single intelligence, the same that guided the planets and stirred the human heart. Temples dedicated to Thoth and Hermes multiplied under new forms. In Hermopolis, at Memphis, and across the Mediterranean in Athens and Antioch, initiates studied the art of ascent. They gathered at night, reading from the Asclepius by lamplight, interpreting the dialogues as codes for transformation. They spoke of the universe as a vast living being, soul, body, and intellect intertwined. The priests still performed sacrifices, but the philosophers sought inward fire. For them, to know the order of creation was to join it. Egypt itself had changed. The grandeur of its monuments had faded, and yet its spirit endured through continuity of thought. The priests who once recorded the rituals of Osiris now taught the discipline of contemplation. They told their Greek and Roman pupils that the gods were not external rulers, but forces within the self. The temples became schools of inward vision. The god of writing had taught the world to read, and now he taught it to look within. It was during this era that Gnosticism and Hermeticism began to intertwine. Both claimed that the divine spark within man had fallen into the material world and must rise again through knowledge. But where the Gnostics saw matter as a prison, the Hermetic philosophers saw it as reflection. The world was not to be escaped, but understood. To them, the fall was not punishment, but opportunity. The descent of light into form so that it might learn to recognize itself. This optimism set Hermetic thought apart from the creeds forming around it. As Christianity spread through the empire, it preached salvation through faith and grace. Hermeticism preached salvation through knowledge and harmony. One demanded belief, the other comprehension. Yet they shared a common yearning, the return to unity. Both spoke of rebirth, both revered the divine word. In Alexandria, Christians and Hermeticists sometimes studied side by side, each translating their mysteries into the other's language. The Asclepius, perhaps the last great work of the ancient priesthood, carried a tone of mourning. It foretold the day when the old religion would vanish, when Egypt's temples would crumble and its gods retreat to the stars. Yet it also promised renewal, that the world would one day rediscover the wisdom it had lost. Its author seemed to sense that an age was ending, that the golden chain connecting heaven and earth was fraying. But he also believed that the divine mind could never be erased, only forgotten. Every cycle of decline carried within it the seed of revival. Through these final centuries, the worship of Thoth persisted under many disguises. His temples had been renamed for Hermes. His priests had become philosophers, yet his essence remained unchanged. He was still the mediator, still the intelligence that binds opposites, spirit and matter, word and silence, light and shadow. In Roman art he appeared as a sage, holding a globe and a serpent, symbols of knowledge and eternity. His followers called themselves the children of the light of mind, and they claimed descent not from a race or a temple, but from thought itself. When the empire reached its height, Hermetic philosophy began to spread beyond Egypt's borders. In Rome, scholars quoted Hermes alongside Plato. In Asia Minor, astrologers invoked him before observing the stars. His teachings found eager audiences among physicians, engineers, and poets. The ideal of the philosopher-priest, the thinker who combines science with sanctity, became the hallmark of the time. The pursuit of wisdom was no longer limited to temples. It was a vocation open to any soul that sought truth without fear. In this way, Thoth's voice continued to echo through the machinery of empire. The Roman bureaucrat calculating taxes by the movement of the sun, the architect designing arches from geometric harmony, the healer preparing medicines according to planetary hours, all served, unknowingly, the same God. The union of intellect and order, of structure and meaning, was his enduring gift. Yet beneath the surface, the old anxiety remained. The priests remembered Setne Khamwas and his punishment. They knew that knowledge, without reverence, turns upon its bearer. To prevent this, they surrounded their doctrines with symbols, disguising truth as allegory, so that only the patient and the pure could discern it. Their secrecy was not arrogance, but protection. The deeper mysteries, the nature of the divine mind, the origin of the soul, were hidden in parables of light, sound, and geometry. These veiled teachings would later be called the hidden doctrine. According to that doctrine, every age receives as much wisdom as it can bear. The gods reveal truth only through proportion, just enough to preserve balance. When the world grows arrogant, the revelation withdraws. When it becomes humble, the light returns. Thus, knowledge itself obeys the law of Ma'at. The rise and fall of civilizations are not accidents, but rhythms in the heartbeat of the cosmos. Egypt, now a province under Rome, had become the example. Though its temples faded, its wisdom spread. Though its gods were renamed, their meaning deepened. As night fell over the Nile, the priests still stood beneath the moon, tracing its arc across the water. They saw in it not loss, but continuity. The light that once guided the pharaohs now shone over the empire that had replaced them. In that reflection, they recognized the work of their own God, the scribe of eternity, still recording, still teaching, still reminding mankind that knowledge and divinity are two halves of the same word. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, Egypt no longer ruled the world, but the world was ruled by ideas that Egypt had first imagined. Temples decayed under foreign banners, yet their symbols migrated into new tongues, new scriptures, new ways of describing the divine. Thoth, now Hermes Trismegistus, survived not through marble or ritual, but through the persistence of thought itself. Across the Roman Empire, his name was invoked in secret gatherings of philosophers and mystics. They called themselves the followers of the hidden light, heirs to a lineage of wisdom that stretched beyond empires and eras. For them, Hermes was not a god of statues, but of understanding, the silent teacher within every reasoning mind. His teachings were recorded in fragile scrolls passed between Alexandria, Athens, and Rome, each written as a dialogue between master and disciple. These texts did not demand belief, they demanded awakening. In the Hermetic schools of Alexandria, initiation no longer required a temple. A student entered not through pillars of stone, but through the act of contemplation. Teachers instructed their pupils to study the natural world until its order revealed itself as reflection of divine mind. Astronomy became theology. Geometry became meditation. The movement of the planets was a hymn written across the heavens, and the human soul, a spark of the same cosmic fire, was capable of reading it. Those who followed this path believed that creation itself was an expression of consciousness. Every form, from the orbit of a star to the growth of a plant, obeyed a pattern that linked the smallest to the greatest. To know that pattern was to align oneself with the will of the divine. The true Hermeticist sought neither miracles nor power. He sought equilibrium, to become, as the ancients said, a co-worker with the mind of God. The Roman world, fascinated yet fearful of this idea, struggled to classify it. To the state, Hermetic philosophy was too fluid to control. To the rising Christian movement, too close to heresy. It spoke of a divinity both immanent and universal, a creator who dwelt not in heaven alone, but within all minds capable of reason. The gods of Olympus had become metaphors. The single God of the Christians remained remote, but Hermes Trismegistus was the bridge between the two, divine reason made intelligible. As Christianity grew, the priests of Egypt watched in silence. They recognized echoes of their own wisdom in the new faith, the word that creates, the light that saves, the promise of rebirth. Yet they also saw how easily mystery could harden into doctrine. Where the Hermetic writings spoke of discovery, the Church began to speak of commandment. Revelation was no longer a dialogue, but a decree. The subtle art of knowing was replaced by the obedience of belief. Still, the Hermetic tradition endured, not in temples, but in hidden circles of seekers who preserved the old methods under new names. They met in homes, in gardens, on terraces overlooking the Mediterranean, reciting passages from the Poemandre and the Asclepius. Their gatherings were half philosophy, half devotion. When asked what they worshipped, they answered, "The mind that perceives order in all things." From these circles emerged a new discipline, a blending of observation, symbol, and experiment that later generations would call alchemy. Its earliest masters saw in metals and minerals a reflection of the soul's own evolution. Lead aspired to become gold, as ignorance aspired to become wisdom. Fire, water, air, and earth were not mere elements, but states of transformation. The laboratory was a miniature cosmos, the crucible a mirror of the human heart. When a substance was purified, so too was the spirit of the one who worked upon it. This practice embodied the essence of the hidden doctrine. The Hermetic teachers had long insisted that truth must be veiled, for those unready to receive it could mistake symbol for fact and turn wisdom into arrogance. The alchemists preserved that veil through allegory, speaking of furnaces and metals when they meant consciousness and virtue. Their secrecy was not fear, but reverence. They believed that divine knowledge reveals itself only through proportion. Too much light blinds, too much shadow deceives. Meanwhile, Alexandria remained a fading beacon. The city's scholars still lectured, but the empire's attention had turned elsewhere, to wars, reforms, and the rise of new religions. When the Serapeum was destroyed and its library scattered, many believed the age of Hermes had ended. Yet the god of writing had anticipated such losses. His wisdom had already migrated beyond the Nile, carried in copied texts and trained minds. The divine scribe had simply changed his dwelling from papyrus to memory. Fragments of the Hermetica reached philosophers in Athens, Antioch, and Carthage. Even Christian theologians studied them in secret. Clement of Alexandria and Origen quoted Hermes as though he were a prophet of natural law. Some went so far as to claim that Hermes had foreseen the coming of the Christian revelation, that his teachings were the dawn before the new faith's sunrise. To others, he was proof that wisdom is eternal and cannot belong to a single creed. During this late imperial period, as the Roman world drifted toward decline, the Hermetic spirit became a quiet refuge for those weary of conflict. Empires could fall, but truth, they said, could not be conquered. The universe remained a living text written by the same hand, its words visible to anyone willing to read with humility. Philosophy, once confined to elites, became a spiritual practice for common men and women who sought inner peace amid chaos. The god of intellect had become the god of endurance. When Constantine embraced Christianity and the empire began to change its soul, the remaining followers of Hermes adapted once more. Some entered monasteries, seeing in monastic silence a reflection of the Hermetic vow of contemplation. Others disguised their teachings as astrology or medicine. In those forms, the old doctrine persisted. Physicians spoke of the balance of humors. Astrologers mapped the harmony between planets and flesh. Mathematicians spoke of ratios that mirrored creation's design. Beneath each discipline lay the same faith, that the universe is intelligible because it was made by intelligence. By the 5th century, Egypt's temples had fallen quiet. The statues of Thoth and Isis were carried away or buried, their worship condemned by decree. Yet the Hermetic writings, translated into Latin and Syriac, slipped through the net of suppression. Monks who copied scripture also copied these older texts, mistaking them for works of early prophets. The divine scribe had once again disguised himself, not as a god, but as a philosopher whose words could hide within the libraries of the New World. In the monasteries of the desert, the echo of Egypt's wisdom survived in subtler forms. Hermits meditated on silence as the language of God. Ascetics practiced purification of thought as alchemists purified metals. The desert itself became the new temple, vast, still, and full of unseen life. The moon that had guided Thoth's worshippers now guided monks who prayed by its light. The transformation was complete. Religion had absorbed philosophy, and philosophy had preserved the ghost of the old religion. The hidden doctrine endured precisely because it hid within opposites. It could speak as science or as mysticism, as faith or as reason, and in each form it said the same thing, that all things originate from a single mind, and that the purpose of knowledge is to restore harmony between the seen and the unseen. By the end of antiquity, the Roman Empire itself began to unravel, but the Hermetic seed had already taken root in the soil of many cultures. From Alexandria to Constantinople, from Syria to the Latin West, the idea of divine intellect survived under countless disguises. It was whispered in the equations of mathematicians, in the chants of monks, and in the experiments of alchemists who saw in every reaction a parable of rebirth. The empire that had once believed it conquered Egypt now carried Egypt's spirit within its own reason. The God who had taught men to write and to measure had written himself into their sciences, their faiths, and their sense of order. Even as temples crumbled, the invisible architecture of thought remained, a lattice of correspondences linking heaven, earth, and the human mind. Thus ended the age of the visible Thoth. His ibis no longer walked along the Nile. His priests no longer raised hymns beneath the moon. Yet his truest temple had never been of stone. It was the capacity of humanity to think, to question, to seek pattern amid chaos. That temple still stood, and through it, the divine scribe continued his work, writing not upon papyrus, metal, but upon the fragile, enduring page of consciousness itself. As the empire that had ruled the world began to fracture, the old gods withdrew. The temples of Egypt fell silent, their libraries scattered, their priests forgotten. Yet in the ashes of empire, fragments of Hermetic wisdom survived, small embers carried by exiles, scholars, and dreamers into the darkness of the coming centuries. What began in the stone halls of Thebes would now whisper through monasteries, workshops, and observatories from the Mediterranean to Persia. The voice of Thoth had learned to speak in secrecy. The new world that rose from the ruins of Rome spoke many tongues, but shared one conviction, that the visible world was only half the truth. Between heaven and earth, there existed a web of hidden forces, binding stars, metals, plants, and souls in a single design. The early alchemists called this design the Great Work, not merely the transmutation of lead into gold, but the transformation of ignorance into knowledge, of division into unity. Behind their furnaces and alembics, they saw the same vision that had animated Hermopolis and Alexandria, the belief that the divine mind expresses itself through pattern, and that to understand those patterns is to draw nearer to God. In the Arabic-speaking world, this belief flourished. The scholars of Baghdad, Harran, and Cordoba inherited the legacy of both Greece and Egypt. They translated the Corpus Hermeticum alongside the works of Aristotle and Plato, preserving texts that might otherwise have vanished. To them, Hermes Trismegistus was not a pagan idol, but a prophet identified with Idris, the antediluvian sage who taught humanity the sciences. In Islamic lore, Idris was said to have ascended to the heavens before the flood, and to have written books on medicine, astrology, and the art of purification. Through this identification, the Egyptian god of wisdom became part of a monotheistic lineage, standing beside Enoch and the patriarchs. From these translations arose a new synthesis of thought. Greek rationalism, Egyptian symbolism, and Islamic theology intertwined. The Hermetic principle that all things correspond became the foundation of medieval science. Alchemists studied minerals not only to produce gold, but to understand how creation renews itself. Physicians treated illness as imbalance between cosmic elements. Astronomers mapped the heavens as reflections of the human body. Everywhere the universe was read as a divine text, its letters written in fire and water, air and earth. The most famous fragment of this tradition was a short, enigmatic work known as the Emerald Tablet. Its words were few, but their echoes stretched across centuries. It declared that what is above mirrors what is below, that all things arise from one source, and that through this unity the miracle of existence is performed. No one could trace its origin. Some said it had been carved by Hermes himself upon a green stone and hidden in a vault beneath a statue. Others believed it was a lost page from the Book of Thoth, recovered by alchemists in the East. Whatever its provenance, the tablet condensed the wisdom of millennia into a single formula of correspondence. To the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age, this doctrine justified the search for universal harmony. It meant that studying nature was a form of prayer. Chemistry, mathematics, and astronomy were not separate pursuits, but steps in the same ascent. Behind every experiment lay a metaphysical ambition: to uncover the divine order that sustains the world. The astronomer's observation of planetary motion, the mathematician's equation, and the mystic's contemplation of light were variations of one act, the reading of the cosmic book. In Egypt itself, this continuity lingered beneath the surface of daily life. The temples had closed, but their symbols endured in art and superstition. Amulets of the ibis and the moon were still worn for protection. The idea of the house of life survived in the libraries of monasteries, where monks copied texts in Coptic and Greek. Even within Christian Egypt, echoes of the Hermetic world remained. In the veneration of light, in the belief that silence reveals truth, in the conviction that wisdom is an act of remembrance. As knowledge traveled westward, the Arabic translators became the new scribes of Thoth. Their works crossed into Sicily and Spain, where Latin scholars rediscovered them. The writings of Jabir ibn Hayyan, al-Kindi, and the mysterious Hermes Trismegistus himself were rendered into the language of the medieval universities. Europe, emerging from its long sleep, awakened to a vision of a universe both rational and divine. The same sentences that had once been carved on papyrus now inspired the first experiments of modern science. In monasteries and courts alike, the Hermetic image of man, as microcosm reflecting the macrocosm, shaped medicine, architecture, and art. Cathedrals rose according to geometric harmonies thought to mirror the proportions of creation. Physicians prescribed remedies according to the phases of the moon. Scholars spoke of hidden virtues within stones and herbs, remnants of the divine word imprinted at the dawn of time. For every discipline, from theology to mathematics, there existed an invisible twin, a spiritual counterpart governed by the same order. Yet this knowledge could not be taught openly. The church that dominated medieval Europe mistrusted anything that blurred the boundary between creator and creation. To claim that the divine lived within matter was perilously close to heresy. Thus, the Hermetic philosophers wrapped their insights in code. They wrote of furnaces and elixirs, of serpents and suns, of marriages between metals, allegories for the purification of the soul. Their secrecy was survival. In an age of faith enforced by fire, the old wisdom hid behind symbols of transformation. Still, its influence grew. Every monastery, with a library, possessed a few anonymous treatises on alchemy or cosmology that traced their roots to Egypt. In the courts of Al-Andalus, scholars blended Hermetic philosophy with Kabbalistic and Sufi mysticism, producing a language of unity that transcended creed. They spoke of a single light that manifests in many forms, of a divine breath that animates all beings. The language of Thoth had become universal once again, spoken now in Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and whispered in the experiments of those who sought the stone of wisdom. Through this transmission, the figure of Hermes evolved once more. To the medieval imagination, he was no longer simply the god or the sage, but the first scientist. He was credited with inventing writing, mathematics, and astronomy. In him, reason and revelation met without conflict. The scholars who invoked his name saw themselves as continuing his work, uncovering the secrets of creation while honoring its sanctity. To think, for them, was to pray with the intellect. As the centuries turned, the spirit of the old world persisted beneath layers of dogma. Monks who copied scripture often paused to decorate margins with celestial diagrams or coded references to the planets. Artisans carved the ibis and the crescent into cathedral stone, perhaps without knowing whose symbols they were. The moon that had once guided Egyptian ritual still ruled the calendar of Christendom. The alchemists who labored in hidden workshops repeated, in their own language, the devotion of Thoth's earliest priests, to keep alive the balance between heaven and earth, matter and mind. In the Islamic East, the scholars of Haran, descendants of the ancient star worshippers of Mesopotamia, preserved another link to the past. They regarded Hermes Trismegistus as the founder of their science, the master of astrology and geometry. When the Abbasid caliphs asked for knowledge of the heavens, they answered with translations of his works. Through them, Egypt's ancient god of calculation became the patron of Islamic astronomy. His name appeared in treatises on medicine, optics, and mechanics, a quiet thread connecting the laboratories of Baghdad to the sanctuaries of the Nile. By the late Middle Ages, these currents had spread across the known world. In Prague, Toledo, and Paris, scholars debated the Emerald Tablet and its cryptic promise that transformation within mirrors transformation without. They saw in its brevity a distillation of every science, chemistry, theology, and metaphysics united. For some, it was a formula for alchemy. For others, a prayer. For all, it was proof that the divine order could still be read by those who looked closely enough. The god who once walked the halls of Hermopolis had become an invisible companion to every seeker of hidden truths. His temples were now laboratories, his priests philosophers, his hymns equations. Yet his essence remained unchanged. He was still the scribe who wrote the laws of creation, still the voice that translated eternity into time. Through the veil of alchemy and the secrecy of the scholars, Thoth continued his ancient task, to remind humanity that the pursuit of knowledge is holy, and that every discovery, if made in reverence, is a step back toward the divine order that first spoke the world into being. In the dim candlelight of a medieval workshop, a monk bent over his manuscripts. Around him, shelves of glass vials glimmered faintly in the glow. The air smelled of sulfur and ink, and on the table lay a piece of parchment filled with symbols that would have puzzled any priest. Suns, serpents, and spirals surrounding the words as above, so below. Outside, snow fell upon a silent town. Inside, the last embers of Egypt burned in a new language. The ancient faith in divine correspondence had crossed oceans of time to find refuge among the scholars of the Middle Ages. What once had been sung in the temples of Thoth now survived behind closed doors, veiled by the terminology of alchemy and natural philosophy. The sacred and the scientific no longer stood apart. The laboratory became a chapel, and the pursuit of matter a pilgrimage towards spirit. To work in secret was not rebellion, but devotion. Knowledge, guarded against misunderstanding, had to disguise itself to survive. In the East, the Islamic world kept that current alive. The philosophers of Baghdad, Harran, and Fez saw Hermes Trismegistus not as a relic of paganism, but as one of the primordial teachers of mankind. They spoke of him as Idris, the prophet who ascended to heaven after mastering the sciences of the earth. His wisdom filled the treatises of mathematicians, physicians, and chemists. When scholars sought the roots of creation, they traced them to his hand. For them, the study of number and proportion was a form of prayer. Every discovery was a small act of remembrance. Through translation and trade, this spirit of inquiry flowed back toward Europe. The words of the old sages arrived in Latin from Arabic. Fragments of the Hermetica, the geometry of Pythagoras, the physics of Aristotle, each layered with commentary that echoed Egyptian cosmology. The revival that followed was quiet at first, growing in the monasteries that doubled as schools. There, monks who studied scripture by day spent the night copying works on medicine and astronomy. The same hand that transcribed a psalm might also sketch the phases of the moon or the proportions of a human skull. This learning reshaped Europe's imagination. The universe came to be seen as a living organism, a web of sympathy connecting stones and stars, bodies and heavens. Every element mirrored another. Iron resonated with Mars, copper with Venus, gold with the sun. The physician looked at illness as disharmony. The architect designed cathedrals as harmonies of light and number. And the alchemist sought not wealth, but purification, of metal, of thought, of soul. Alchemy carried within it the last echo of the ancient Book of Thoth. The alchemist's furnace was a miniature cosmos where base matter died and was reborn. In its crucible, lead was not simply refined, but educated, taught to remember its higher form. The slow transformation mirrored the human journey. Each stage of color, black, white, red, gold, symbolized the evolution of consciousness from ignorance to illumination. To complete the work was to rediscover unity, the same unity Hermes had once described as the mind of the cosmos. The secrecy surrounding this practice had little to do with greed or fear of punishment. Alchemy required inward discipline as much as craft, and only those prepared to confront their own imperfections could hope to succeed. The symbols and metaphors were therefore tests, forcing the reader to think, to struggle, to earn understanding. A single phrase, solve et coagula, dissolve and bind, carried an entire theology, that creation renews itself through change, that spirit and matter forever intertwine. Through this language of transformation, the divine scribe continued his work. The figures drawn on parchment or etched into glass were not decorations. They were prayers in disguise. Each circle represented eternity, each triangle balance, each star the perfection of the 5 elements. Alchemists wrote their formulas as hymns to harmony, convinced that the secrets of God were not hidden in heaven, but embedded in matter. In the libraries of Toledo and Palermo, scholars began to see how the fragments connected. They recognized in the emerald tablet the same ideas that animated Christian mysticism and Jewish Kabbalah. Creation was a reflection of the Creator. The human soul mirrored the divine mind. The three cultures, Arabic, Jewish, and Latin, unknowingly wove a single thread of Hermetic thought. The god of Egypt had found his way into every faith that still dared to think. As the centuries advanced, these ideas took root among thinkers who shaped the coming world. The philosophers of Paris debated the relation between intellect and faith. The builders of cathedrals applied geometry not as engineering, but as devotion. Every arch and rose window embodied proportion and symmetry, the visible expression of Ma'at reborn as architectural law. Even those who never heard the name of Hermes Trismegistus worked within his order, building in stone what the ancients had written in light. Meanwhile, in the East, the chain of transmission continued. Persian mystics described the soul's ascent through 7 stages of refinement. Sufi poets sang of the beloved as an alchemical fire that burns away illusion. Each image, the furnace, the mirror, the stone, echoed the same principle, that truth is discovered through transformation. The legacy of Thoth had crossed faiths without ever losing its shape. In the Christian monasteries of Egypt and Syria, echoes of the old moon god lingered in silence. The desert monks kept night vigils, reading by moonlight, marking the same cycles that had once guided the priests of Hermopolis. In their solitude, they practiced the same discipline: contemplation, order, the measurement of breath and word. Without knowing it, they maintained the rhythm of the God who had first taught humanity to think in pattern. As the medieval centuries drew toward their end, Europe began to awaken again to the dream of knowledge. Trade reopened the roads, and along with goods came manuscripts, Greek, Arabic, Coptic, carrying the seeds of Renaissance thought. Among these, copies of the Hermetica found their way into Italian libraries. Scholars recognized in them something both alien and familiar, a philosophy older than Plato, yet resonant with Christian mysticism. The words of Hermes spoke of the divine within creation, of man as microcosm, of the possibility of illumination through understanding. Those who read these texts felt as though a forgotten light had returned. They sensed that the faith of their ancestors and the reason of their philosophers were not enemies, but complementary paths. The world, after centuries of superstition and fear, appeared once again as intelligible and holy. The age of rediscovery was at hand. Behind this awakening stood the invisible labor of 1,000 unknown scribes, Muslim translators, Jewish commentators, Christian monks, all preserving fragments of the same truth. The line from the temples of Hermopolis to the universities of Europe was unbroken, though few could see it. The divine scribe had written across centuries, not in hieroglyphs, but in human continuity. By the 14th century, alchemy had become both obsession and art. Its symbols covered manuscripts, its metaphors infused poetry, its secrets drew the curious and the wise alike. In its cryptic images lay the entire history of Hermetic thought, the transformation of Thoth into Hermes, of ritual into science, of revelation into philosophy. The god's handwriting had changed, but not his purpose. Each new generation inherited the same vision, that knowledge is not conquest, but communion, that the world is alive with meaning waiting to be read. The priest, the monk, the physician, the craftsman, all were children of the same tradition, participants in the long effort to translate eternity into form. By the end of the Middle Ages, the stage was set for a greater renewal. The manuscripts rescued from Constantinople, the fragments preserved in monasteries, and the formulas whispered in laboratories would converge in the coming century, igniting the Renaissance. The Hermetic flame, long veiled, was ready to blaze again. And somewhere beyond time's horizon, the old god of writing watched as humanity prepared to rediscover what he had never ceased to teach, that the path to the divine is not ascent or conquest, but remembrance, the act of reading the world as if it were sacred, because in truth it always has been. The 15th century opened, and the world was turning back toward light. The long winter of the Middle Ages was ending, and across Europe, scholars began to dig through the dust of forgotten libraries in search of the lost knowledge of antiquity. Ships crossed new oceans, presses filled the air with the smell of ink, and the written word once again became the measure of civilization. In that age of rediscovery, Egypt's ancient voice returned, not in the murmur of priests, but in the whisper of parchment. The God who had once taught humanity to write was preparing to be read again. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 scattered the last remnants of the Greek world. Among the refugees who fled westward were scholars carrying manuscripts rescued from burning libraries, fragments of Plato, Aristotle, and the mysterious writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. These texts, copied and translated over centuries, were now thought lost. Their rediscovery in Italy ignited what would become known as the Hermetic revival. In Florence, under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, humanists began to translate the ancient words into Latin. At their head stood Marsilio Ficino, philosopher, musician, and devotee of the divine intellect. Ficino believed he was not merely translating a text, but restoring a revelation. To him, the corpus hermeticum was older than Moses and purer than philosophy, the first articulation of divine wisdom. In the dialogues of Hermes, he saw the echo of the Christian logos, the same word that shaped the world in Genesis. The Hermetic writings spoke of a single God, of creation through light and reason, of the soul's ascent toward unity. To a Europe seeking harmony between faith and reason, they appeared as confirmation that all truth came from one source. In the halls of the Medici court, scholars read aloud from the new translation. They heard Hermes teach that God is an infinite mind, that the world is his thought, and that man is created in his image so that he might understand the pattern of creation. These were not the words of a pagan idol, but of a prophet of intellect. Ficino's Florence became the new Alexandria, a city where art, science, and mysticism shared the same language. Painters studied geometry as devotion. Architects built cathedrals to the rhythm of proportion. Poets compared the ascent of love to the ascent of the soul through the spheres. From this fusion of belief and reason, the modern spirit emerged. The Hermetic philosophers of the Renaissance did not reject religion. They expanded it. The divine was no longer confined to heaven, but revealed in beauty, number, and order. To study the laws of nature was to read the Book of God. The artist who painted light across a wall, or the astronomer who mapped the sky, served the same master, the eternal scribe who wrote the universe into being. Ficino's translations spread rapidly across Europe. In them, scholars discovered not only theology, but an ethic of curiosity. Hermes Trismegistus urged mankind to become all things, to see in every creature the reflection of the divine. Knowledge was not forbidden fruit, but sacred inheritance. The Renaissance, intoxicated by that permission, began to explore. Maps multiplied, telescopes appeared, and human anatomy was charted with the same reverence once reserved for scripture. The pursuit of understanding, long shadowed by fear, had become holy again. Yet beneath this optimism, lay the same caution that had followed the Book of Thoth since the time of Setne Khamwas. Power required balance. Curiosity demanded humility. The Hermetic philosophers warned that knowledge without wisdom led only to corruption. To know the structure of creation was to share in its responsibility. Many who studied the texts took this warning to heart, blending philosophy with ethics, art with faith. But others saw in Hermes only a promise of mastery, and mastery has its own gravity. In the 16th century, the Hermetic current flowed into the secret societies of Europe. Scholars and mystics formed brotherhoods dedicated to preserving sacred knowledge amid the turbulence of religious wars. The most influential of these movements was the Rosicrucian order, a network of thinkers who claimed inheritance from the ancient wisdom of Egypt. Their manifestos spoke of a reformation of the world through hidden science and moral enlightenment. In their symbols, the rose, the cross, the open book, the spirit of Hermes lived on, coded in emblems that united opposites: life and death, matter and spirit, earth and heaven. Alchemy, too, entered its golden age. Laboratories glowed through the night as seekers chased the secret of transformation. The old Egyptian metaphor of rebirth found new form in the search for the philosopher's stone, not a mineral, but a state of perfection. For some, the quest was literal. For others, it was psychological or spiritual. In the slow purification of metals, they saw an image of the soul refining itself through struggle. Every furnace became a microcosm of the world. Every experiment a reenactment of creation. From these alchemical images would later emerge the modern sciences. Chemists inherited the instruments. Psychologists inherited the metaphors. The dream of unity between matter and spirit, though lost to time, had left its method behind: observation, experiment, and wonder. The god of writing had taught mankind to inscribe his thoughts upon the fabric of the world. In this same period, Hermetic ideas crossed paths with magic and mysticism. The scholars of the Kabbalistic tradition found in Hermes confirmation of their belief in divine correspondence. The letters of the Hebrew alphabet, the geometries of the stars, and the hieroglyphs of Egypt all seem to form one system, a universal grammar of creation. Philosophers like Giordano Bruno proclaimed that the universe was infinite, animated by one mind. For saying aloud what the Hermetic books had whispered, Bruno was condemned to the stake. The old warning proved true once again. The book of divine knowledge could be opened, but never owned. Even as orthodoxy tightened its hold, Hermeticism continued to inspire those who sought harmony between science and spirituality. The astronomer Johannes Kepler wrote that God had written the world in numbers, and to read those numbers was an act of worship. Isaac Newton, the architect of modern physics, filled his notebooks with translations of the Emerald Tablet. Behind his equations lay the same conviction that guided the priests of Hermopolis, that the universe obeys a moral as well as a mathematical order. As centuries passed, the divine scribe acquired new voices. During the Enlightenment, Hermes Trismegistus became a symbol of universal reason. In the Romantic Age, he was the guardian of mystery. Each generation translated him into its own language. The rationalists saw in him the father of science, the mystics the keeper of spiritual law. His essence, like the moon that once bore his sign, changed shape but never substance. In the 19th century, as industrial progress redrew the world, another revival began, not in temples or universities, but in the secret lodges of occult societies. The Theosophical movement, the Golden Dawn, and later thinkers such as Aleister Crowley invoked Hermes as patron of hidden wisdom. For them, the ancient god of balance represented the reconciliation of opposites, spirit and matter, science and art, light and shadow. They named their symbolic tarot the Book of Thoth, seeing in its sequence of images a map of the soul's journey through creation. The ibis of Hermopolis had become a deck of cards, yet its message was unchanged. Knowledge is transformation. In literature, too, the Hermetic image endured. Poets spoke of words as spells, of language as creation. Painters sought divine geometry in the proportions of the human form. The same impulse that once built pyramids now built cathedrals of thought. The modern world, though it believed itself secular, still carried the rhythm of the ancient scribe's pen. Every theory of order, every law of nature, every act of comprehension was another line in the endless manuscript of the divine mind. The 20th century brought both revelation and loss. Archaeologists uncovered papyri, temples, and inscriptions that confirmed Egypt's role as the mother of civilization. The figure of Thoth returned to history books, stripped of divinity but not of mystery. Scholars called him the symbol of intellect. Artists called him the guardian of memory. Even when reduced to myth, he remained the measure of the human desire to understand. From the perspective of millennia, the Book of Thoth reveals itself not as an artifact, but as an idea. It was never a scroll buried in sand. It was the conviction that knowledge connects the mortal to the eternal. Each age writes its own chapter. The priests of Hermopolis with their hymns, the philosophers of Alexandria with their dialogues, the alchemists with their experiments, the scientists with their equations. The book is not found. It is written again and again by every mind that seeks truth without fear. And so, in the present age, when light travels faster than thought and machines store more memory than any scribe, the same question that haunted Setne Khamwas still lingers. How much wisdom can humanity bear before it loses balance? We stand surrounded by knowledge, yet still search for meaning, still tracing the same feather of Mayat across the scales of our own hearts. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of Thoth. Not the perfection of intellect, but the humility that comes with it. Every discovery demands reflection. Every word must answer to silence. The god of writing does not promise mastery, only remembrance. He reminds us that the universe began with speech, but endures through listening. At dusk on the Nile, when the horizon glows like a page before the first stroke of ink, the story comes full circle. The ibis stands in the shallows, patient as eternity, its curved beak tracing invisible symbols across the water. The same motion repeats in the human hand that writes, paints, calculates, and dreams. The Book of Thoth was never hidden. It has always been open, written in moonlight and reflection, awaiting readers who understand that to know is not to possess, but to participate. From papyrus to print, from temple wall to glowing screen, the divine record continues. Every thought, every act of creation, every attempt to bring order to chaos is another line in that immortal manuscript. We are still writing it, still reading it, still listening for the quiet rustle of the god's pen across the surface of time.